Okay, well, thank you and welcome everyone for joining us today. I'm Claire Rafferty and I'm chairing the seminar today. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm on Gamilaroi country today and pay my respects to custodians past, present and future, and extend that acknowledgement out to all the different countries that you are calling in from today, because I know we are spread across a large geographic region by the looks of it. And so some of you were probably here for the 2 weeks ago when Bill Fogarty did the seminar on place-based learning and talked a lot about learning on country. And it's part of a 3-part seminar series that Bill 2 weeks ago, Marnie today, and myself in another 2 weeks looking at community-centred approaches to learning. And I'll just give a quick reminder to people. I know you're all familiar with the Zoom etiquette and protocols, but inevitably there's often a microphone left on. So if everybody during the presentation, if everybody could turn the mics off and turn videos off, and then we'll restart those after the Q&A. That would be great. Thank you. And yeah, so we'll following Marnie's seminar, we'll have the Q&A probably for about half an hour. So to make a start, I'll introduce Marnie. Some of you will know her, but Marnie is a research fellow at CAEPR and has a background in education. Just a reminder again for mics off, please, just because it can be a little bit, can take the focus a little away. So Marnie's also the co-chair of the Indigenous Literacy Foundation. Before undertaking her doctoral studies at the University of Melbourne under the supervision of Professor Marcia Langton, Marnie worked for more than a decade with First Nations young people in a range of education and pastoral care settings. From 2012 to 2019, she led the Victorian Indigenous Education Network of schools in the independent and Catholic sectors. That organisation was established by teachers working in member schools to raise awareness and drive change in institutions built around strongly Eurocentric ideals. Marnie's PhD study focused on the lived experience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students in Australian boarding schools. Her more recent work investigates the impact of boarding school policy on secondary education outcomes of young people in remote Australia. Her forthcoming book, Boarding and Australia's First Nations, Understanding How Residential Schooling Shapes Lives, will be published by Springer Nature as part of their Indigenous Settler Relations in Australia and the World series. And that book is due to be released later this year. So thank you, Marnie. Very much looking forward to this seminar, and I will hand it over to you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much indeed, Claire. I'm just going to start to share my screen here. I would also like to begin by acknowledging countries and acknowledging First Nations leaders past, present and emerging.
Can you send me some soup in a little bowl? In a little bowl? You don't want a big bowl? No, just with a little bowl with pepper. All right.
Somebody needs to put, sorry, somebody needs to put their microphone on mute, please. And I do just want to confirm that you're seeing this. Yes, that's better.
Yeah, we can see that.
Yeah.
That's great.
Thank you very much indeed. I would like to pay my respects particularly to the Wurundjeri people. I'm joining you from Melbourne this morning, and I'm going to be reporting on work that I've conducted with First Nations people and families over many years now, and I want to acknowledge particularly every single person who's contributed to this research. The narratives that they have shared with me are theirs. They always were, they always will be. And I'm very aware that speaking about my research comes with a particular responsibility. I noticed that Jessa Rogers is here as well. Hi, Jessa. I would particularly like to acknowledge you and the work that you've also done in this space. And I'm sure that when we come to question time, you will also have your own contributions to make. So thanks so much for coming. Before I begin, in earnest in sharing my findings, I would like to acknowledge that boarding schools in the US and Canada, called residential schools, have a terrible history throughout the settler colonial world. They were a key plank in the larger colonial project to eradicate language, culture, and the distinctive First Nations identity. Native children were forcibly removed en masse from their families and sent to live in residential schools as a way to address the Indian problem in North America and Canada. In America, the policy was justified on the basis that it was necessary to kill the Indian in him to save the man. That's a famous quote by Pratt in 1892. Tragically, in many cases, neither the Indian nor the man survived. You may well have heard that in May this year, 215 graves were discovered by First Nations people at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia.
Depending on how much use or whether they're in a nice warm climate or all that sort of stuff, you know.
Could we have microphones
Can
off?
we have mics off, please, everybody? Someone's got their mic on and it really interrupts the presentation. So everyone just turn their mics off, thanks.
A month later, in June this year, a further 700 unmarked graves were discovered in the Merivale Indian Residential School in Saskatchewan province. However much boarding is wrapped in the language of opportunity and choice, any policy priority of sending children away from families and communities inevitably resonates with assimilatory practices of the past. As many of you know, for much of the last 20 years, I've had a strong focus on the experience of First Nations students boarding in schools off-country. For 10 years, I taught in an elite boarding school in Melbourne, where I also ran part of the school's Indigenous program. In 2013, I left teaching to undertake research into the lived experience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students in boarding. What led me into that work was lived experience of my own. In particular, the succession of kids who'd ended up sleeping on mattresses on our floor after the wheels had fallen off at boarding school. In my book coming out in November, which will be published by Springer, some of those young people and many others have chosen to be identified by name as collaborators. Our aim has been to put the authentic human story around the hubris and spin which often informs public perceptions of Indigenous boarding programs. I will be drawing on that work, but also on the subsequent study that Bill and I conducted, mapping the education histories of a cohort of secondary-aged youth from one single community in the Northern Territory. For them, of course, the only option for secondary school was to board off country. To frame up today's seminar, I'm going to invite you to think about an important threshold question. What is the ultimate aim of education? We need to have a clear idea of where we're going if we want to work out the best way to get there. Understanding the aim and the objective of education is really important. To answer this question, I've worked within a human development frame. Human development theory begins with the essential premise that people should be at the centre of all development. Not return on investment, not a set of matrices where achievements can be ticked off, but real flesh and blood people in all the messy complexities of their lives. Human development theory argues that development should enlarge individual choice. It should develop a person's full potential and give them a reasonable chance of leading productive and creative lives in accordance with their own needs, interests, and priorities. Human development is concerned with the development of individual capabilities, but also with the ways in which people are free to express and exercise those capabilities. Whereas welfare positions individuals as beneficiaries of the development process, human development sees them as participants in it. Welfare is driven from the supply side of the equation. Development responds to demand. Using that lens, I think the question about the aim of education can be answered very simply. The objective of secondary education, as I see it, is to enable a young person to thrive. So what does that look like? A young person who's thriving knows who they are and where they belong. They're able to exercise choice. They have skills and knowledge to make good decisions and have been set up to make a contribution to the society in which they live. Paid employment might be one aspect of that, but only one. A young person who's thriving sees life as meaningful. Education is the bedrock on which any society is built. For that reason, education is deemed to be a fundamental human right, enshrined both in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948 and in the International Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1990. The UN Declaration of Rights for Indigenous People establishes the right for Indigenous people to access culturally informed and responsive education, including education in their own language. Australia is, of course, a signatory to all of these conventions. Wherever education occurs, on country or off, these objectives should remain a constant. They should be the baseline for families who are making free, prior and informed choices for their children, for teachers who meet them at the chalk face. These priorities should be writ large in the room where policymakers and bean counters decide on resource allocation in education. For education to develop in a young person the capabilities that they need to live a life they have reason to value, the system must first demonstrably value the young person themselves. It must value the things the young person values. And it must begin by identifying what those things are. Where they include family, the school-family relationship should reflect mutual respect and acknowledgement. Where they include language and culture, those elements should be visible in and around the school, reflected in curriculum, in the built environment, in relationships cultivated with the express purpose of honouring the heritage of the young person that they've undertaken to nurture. They should understand the aspirations of the young person within the context of their life and their worldview. That includes appreciating that the aspirations of a young person from remote Australia may or may not look distinctly different from their urban middle class peers. The American Declaration of Independence identifies the pursuit of happiness as an inalienable right given to all humans by their creator. We do well to hold that thought as we move on to think about the remote education landscape in Australia. Secondary education policy and provision for First Nations people in remote Australia is typically characterised as a wicked problem. It's described in persistently deficit terms. It's deemed too difficult, too expensive, too hard to staff or resource. Meeting the educational needs of this demographic is presented as being just too hard. Actual data around resourcing and discrepant funding available for remote education is slippery and hard to access. The Northern Territory is the only jurisdiction in Australia which has a clearly articulated policy for remote Indigenous secondary education. Their Indigenous Education Strategy 2015 to 2024 emerged from a review conducted by independent consultant Bruce Wilson in 2014. One of the key elements of the Wilson Review was the proposal to shift the delivery of most senior and middle years schooling solely to urban and large regional centres. As this slide indicates, any young person who elects to remain in community can access a rudimentary post-primary literacy and numeracy program at their local primary school. In the first instance, the Northern Territory Government committed $40.5 million to funding to build residential facilities in urban centres to accommodate senior students from remote Indigenous communities. And many of you will be aware that one of those institutions was built in Nhulunbuy. Of course, Yolngu homeland families had been asked for that school to be built at Garthalala. And last time I visited that boarding facility in Nhulunbuy, there were no Yolngu students there. Students who were living in that school at the time had come down from Croker Island. Other jurisdictions in remote Australia are policy-free zones when it comes to secondary education. But in every state and territory, the closure of high schools in remote area is positioned as a logical response to the lower educational achievements of remote schools. The impact of chronic underfunding of remote schools, revealed, for example, by John Taylor's work in Wadair in 2009, or the inequities produced when schools' revenue is calculated on a basis which fails to take into account the real needs of students, appear to hold little sway against the inexorable determination of governments to send kids away from home for their education. Since I started my work in 2013, a plethora of reports, investigations, studies, trials, and policies have all emerged, centred on boarding schools. But I would caution that very few reference original first-person data from Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander students who have lived or are living in boarding schools. And I would say that, Jessa, your research is a shining light in that space. Between them, these pieces of work have looked at issues of access, funding, productivity, mental health. They've considered the particular challenges facing families in geographically remote regions. Many describe boarding using the language of opportunity and choice, although nothing could be further from the truth for remote families. While they acknowledge challenges, many continue to present boarding as unequivocally good. Almost all presume that it is an inevitability. Picking up on this as a business opportunity, one of the peak bodies for boarding in Australia, aptly named Boarding Australia, rebranded itself 2 years ago as Indigenous Education and Boarding Australia. That organisation now claims that its vision is that all Indigenous students attain education outcomes that enable them to be successful in their future choices. In all of those studies, reports, analyses, even in many of the PhD theses, there has been almost no consideration of how boarding impacts on language proficiency and the intergenerational transference of traditional knowledge for remote living young people who spent the majority of their adolescence away from home. Until now, there's been no investigation of the longer term implications of attending boarding school. I would like to go to the next slide. There we are. I'm going to talk now about the funding of boarding programs. In terms of the cost of boarding off-country, there's been no quantitative work to assess how the financial investment in boarding stacks up against funding for alternative approaches to remote education. The federal government's financial commitment to boarding off-country comes in the form of ab-study payments, recurrent government funding, which is largely administered by state and territory governments and non-government education agencies. Special grants are made under the Indigenous Advancement Strategy, and the occasional media release announces the grant of funds to the pet project of a particular Member of Parliament. These payments can be significant, but they very often fly under the radar. We know that the federal government has invested heavily in scholarships for students to attend fee-paying schools. Just how heavily is difficult to ascertain, with money coming from a range of different sources and funding announcements not always made easily accessible. While Learning on Country programs rejoice in even the smallest funding allotments, boarding programs attract enormous support. To give you an idea of the quantum involved, this slide shows a financial statement of one provider, the Australian Indigenous Education Foundation, for last year. You can see that over the span of the last 11 years, this organisation has raised in excess of $238 million. That's a significant sum in anyone's language. So far, they've supported 702 students to complete Year 12, which they tell us represents a 96% completion rate. But these figures should come with a caveat. AIEF does not account for students who drop out in their first year. They have a retrospective funding model, which they tell us minimises wastage of government funding. They do not tell us how long each of these students spent in boarding. I know that at Scotch College in Melbourne, which is an AIEF partner school and the school which I taught in, there was a strong preference not to take students until Year 10. There was also a strong preference to accept young men from urban or regional, not from remote families, although for outstanding football players, exceptions were frequently made. Of course, more than 80% of Australia's First Peoples live in urban or regional settings. For them, generously funded scholarship programs like this provide access to schools which would otherwise be beyond the financial means of most families. These schools offer a distinct advantage. The architecture of Australia's education system, which I'll speak about a little later, means that students attending high fee-paying private schools are better positioned to gain access to competitive tertiary courses. What's less obvious to the outsider is that the independent school sector in Australia is renowned for the social networks it engenders, valuable in themselves. The power of the old school tie continues to open doors for alumni throughout their adult lives. Many strong voices advocate for our First People to be inducted into these networks through the provision of funded places in elite schools. My ears ring with the voices of many parents I've spoken to who told me that they know these schools are not perfect, but they are the only way that their kids are going to penetrate those privileged echelons of Australian society. Of course, for the 20% of First Peoples who live in remote Australia, there is no plan B, and that's a big problem. Young people in this demographic are more likely to be traditionally oriented and have a first language other than English. They have distinct social, educational, and health profiles which urban educators with Eurocentric perceptions of the world may or may not recognise, understand, or be equipped to provide for. Despite this, the infrastructure of local secondary provision has largely been dismantled in remote Australia. In the Northern Territory in 2021, there are 78 communities which have no secondary provision and no alternative programs to re-engage students who've dropped out of the mainstream. Despite a growing research base which points to a range of negative unintended consequences of boarding school for remote living young people, policy settings remain firmly fixed on the boarding sector as the sole provider for a secondary education. I want to ask what the logic is behind this. And to answer that question, we need to turn to the architecture of the Australian education system. There is a compelling logic to sending the most educationally disadvantaged students to the best resourced schools in the country. We need to be clear about this. Our education system is one of the most inequitable on the planet. We love to think of ourselves as a classless society, but nothing could be further from the truth when it comes to education. The public-private divide runs deep in this country and is entrenched in education funding arrangements. In 2019, the ABC conducted a special investigation into capital expenditure in Australian schools. Based on the school finance figures from Australian Government's My School website, they found that Australia's 4 richest schools spent more money on new facilities and renovations than the poorest 1,800 combined. As Gonski, Gillard and Rudd all found, challenging those arrangements is mighty hard. Government schools are funded exclusively by the state and territory governments, whereas schools in the independent and Catholic sectors receive income from both the federal government and by levying fees. We are the only country in the OECD where this happens. 3 out of every $5 spent by the federal government on education is directed to the independent school sector. This funding model in itself raises a major concern. The OECD has found that in settings like ours, where there are differential levels of government, spending capacities of richer and poorer jurisdictions will exacerbate inequality of opportunity for students in different parts of the country. A private school charging $60,000 per annum for a boarding place in Melbourne will also receive federal government funding. Of course, that school will have a whole lot more capacity to provide a quality education product than a remote school in the territory where the government calculates funds based on effective attendance of a student rather than on their actual learning needs. The more a young person is dropping through the cracks, the less money is available to re-engage them. The independent school sector in Australia represents a concentration of privilege where barriers to entry for people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are high. The most evident barrier is, of course, financial. Successive governments have struggled to contain this problem, but challenging the hegemony of the private school sector strikes at the heart of parents and grandparents who are amongst the 34.3% who send their children to non-government schools. Rather than jeopardise their own children's education, socially minded Australians recognise that if privilege is the problem, it should also be part of the solution. The great irony is that they insist on their right to choose the education they want for their kids, while their philanthropic dollar is actually reducing choice for those who need it most. I believe it's right and proper that we think about how remote families might leverage the capacity of the independent school sector to the benefit of their young people. Perhaps it's a step in the right direction that just this month the federal government has announced over $100 million of grants for the private school sector to build or partner with schools in remote Australia. The real question is how much of that money is going to be put into a genuine co-design process to make sure any schools or partnerships are built around community aspiration. So why is it that the proliferation of scholarship programs has happened in recent years? And is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? This is not the first time in history that Australian boarding schools have been co-opted into the quest to deliver quality education to kids from the bush. Many of our national leaders have done a stint in boarding school, and some of their voices have been the most strident in supporting this approach. What has changed this time is that there has been such a proliferation of programs and funds pouring into them. This tells us a few things. The whole scholarship movement, I think, is an idea whose time has arrived because It reflects the fact that Australians really do care about the ongoing injustice for First Nations people in the bush. Donating to a scholarship, billeting a kid, is something positive and proactive that they can do. It makes sense to them. It's a good news story and they want to be part of it. And so does the corporate community. And there's the rub. It has to be simple, digestible, relatable. It has to be a good news story or those funds won't keep rolling in. The most frequent question I get about my work is, well, are scholarships good or are they not? Are we doing the right thing? And I have to tell you, I can't give a simple answer to that question. I can say there's a whole lot of unconscionable conduct behind those front page pictures which appear on a regular basis in the Australian newspaper. My work is largely qualitative, but I haven't told you a single story. I haven't told you about the 17-year-old young man physically shaking and crying, saying no, he doesn't want to record a video in language, only to be told that his $60,000 scholarship position in the school gives him no choice. I haven't told you about all the young people who account how the blackest kids are always pulled forward for photo shoots and asked to perform acknowledgements of country. I haven't told you about the young woman who told me that who was told that if she dropped out of school, her parents would have to repay the $50,000 in fees, which the scholarship provider would only pay retrospectively. That money would only become available to the school if she completed the school year. I haven't told you how sick her father was at the time, or how she was later expelled for drinking a can of UDL in the toilet all by herself. She was in year 8 at the time. I haven't told you about the kid who was asked to give his testimony to a fundraising dinner, about how he had to succeed at school because his mum had taken her own life because she didn't feel good enough for him and his younger sister anymore. They raised $600,000 on that night. I was told that story from 2 teachers and a parent in the school. When I followed up to ask about his well-being 6 years later, I was told that he too had taken his own life. Are boarding scholarships a good thing? For many young people they are, but they're not as good as honesty, transparency, and accountability. There's another bigger downside to all this hype. And here at CAEPR, we understand it well. State and territory responsibility for remote education provision, action from the federal government and philanthropic worlds is offered, it's extremely welcome. I would argue that this has led to a wholesale abrogation of duty for the provision of education in the bush. As we speak, there is a whole generation of teenagers out there who are having no investment made in their lives. The study that Bill and I undertook of one remote Northern Territory community is the only one of its kind to measure the impact of boarding only secondary education on a single community. The government mandated boarding in the stroke of a pen, but boarding places did not pop up overnight. The cohort of 100 young people who we followed in our study had been sent to 38 different schools in 16 different towns or cities across every mainland state of Australia. In 2019, you can see that they were being sent to 10 different schools. I might add that when COVID struck, every one of those 22 students returned to school and dropped out of school for the year 2020. I believe that some have re-engaged now. How long did they stay in school? Well, a second pattern that we discerned in this study was that of early disengagement. Most young people had dropped out in their first year and returned home with nothing to re-engage them until CDP kicked in when they turned 17. Many of these young people were aged between 12 and 13 years of age. When I asked Miriam Rose Ongamar what it takes for kids to succeed at school, she responded, "Don't treat our kids as individuals. They're not individuals, they're part of a collective. If you're going to deal with the child, deal first with the collective." That's hard to do when your kids have been dispersed like a pack of cards. I began this presentation by asking, what is the goal of education? I believe that it is to set young people up to thrive. It's to see them emerge from school knowing who they are and where they belong. Yes, in a modern world, traditionally oriented First Nations young people do need to work in two worlds. They do need to be fluent in English. That's a given. The question is whether boarding sets them up to do that. I would argue that mainstream boarding schools, so long the instrument of choice for the assimilatory agenda, can only ever really satisfy the mandates of one world. What this means for ancient knowledge systems, languages, wisdom of the land is frightening. I often use the analogy that Christian churches are not maintained by people who drop in at Christmas and at Easter. There is a heavy weight of responsibility on boarding schools who take traditionally oriented young people and seek to nurture them through their secondary years. Is boarding school a good thing? One of my darling dad's favourite statements was, "There is no sin except the sin of excess. All things are good in moderation." So when people ask me, is boarding school a good thing? I like to say, in moderation. I'm going to finish there because I think that there might be lots of questions. I've got other slides that I can share with you showing different figures coming out of the study that we did in the Northern Territory. But Claire, I might hand back to you to coordinate the questions if that's all right.
Sure. Thank you, Marnie. What an amazing presentation. You've raised some really critical issues that need discussion, and I'm sure that is going to follow. So thank you very much. Really, really interesting work.